Wild Beyond the Witchlight, we have Archfey coming up. You are a fantastic hag player, Fey creature player, all of that, and you love the Feywild. Do you have advice for people that need to play an Archfey, whether you're a dungeon master or maybe a player wants to be a formerly removed Archfey and now is like a lowly level 1 warlock or something like that? Like, what kind of tips and tricks do you have?
One of the things that I love about the Feywild, and the thing I love about it is also true of its most powerful beings, the Archfey, and that is that it is a realm of extreme emotion. And so that's something to channel whenever a person is DMing or playing a character or creature that is suffused with the magic of the Feywild. And that is, if you feel something, you feel it powerfully. It's sort of like if you imagine the way a human might feel something, and the dial might go up to 10. Well, in the Feywild, it goes at least up to 11, if not higher. And the other thing is that in the Feywild, because of these extremes, this means not only do you have extreme beauty and glory, but it also means when things get wicked, they get very, very wicked. Or, and I often do this when I'm role-playing hags, if things get mischievous, they get very, very mischievous. So really, role-playing someone from the Feywild is an opportunity to pick a particular sort of personality mode and really lean into it a bit further than you would for a mortal. Because, and that's another key thing to remember, especially if you're playing a person or some other kind of creature that has the Fey creature type, you're not a mortal being at that point. And so your perspective is very different. And I often, as a DM, love having that in mind, not only when I roleplay hags, for example, which, hags are some of my favorite creatures in the whole game to roleplay, but this is also true when I roleplay dragons, liches, angels, anything that has lived for centuries. That fact alone means their perspective on reality is different from ours. And that means they will often be far more patient about the unfolding of plans than humans will be. But it can also mean they can be more impatient, because imagine all of the petty things in life that wear on us.
Yeah.
Now imagine having to be exposed to those things for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is also why I often have hags, like, they just cannot even, because they have been around the block so many times.
Right.
And so again, I think those are all things to think about. Extreme emotion, longevity. Also consider whimsy, because whether someone from the Feywild is wicked or benevolent, wherever they are in sort of a moral spectrum, there should always be a little bit of whimsy, because the Feywild is inspired by fairy tales from the real world. And so even when you're in a terrifying place in the Feywild, there might still be something that will make people smile. And this is especially something to think about as a DM. When you're describing a terrifying location or a terrifying creature in the Feywild, what is that little bit of whimsy you can sprinkle in? The teacup on the shelf might be commenting on what's going on. It might otherwise be a typical dungeon environment for D&D, but there's the talking teacup. Or as you near the haunted castle on some moor within the Feywild, the stream that you walk by might literally be singing. And now, if you were in some other part of the Feywild, the song might be cheery, but perhaps as you approach that haunted castle, the song you hear coming from the stream is about your upcoming doom. There's so much room for play, whether it's describing the environment or playing an archfey or some other Feywild influenced creature, not only in the Wild Beyond the Witchlight, but in any D&D game that's connected to the Feywild in some way.
The weird thing about the Feywild and the Shadowfells, they feel like the both furthest ends of Halloween.
Yes. Yes.
They're both creepy in very different ways. I talked to Chris about this, like the Shadowfell is about repetition, it feels like, and the Feywild is like, no, you have no solid ground to stand on here. What do you like about that kind of like give and take between those two?
I like to think of the Feywild and the Shadowfell almost as characters. You could imagine that the Feywild, to use a Winnie the Pooh reference,
Okay.
you could almost think of the Feywild as Tigger and the Shadowfell as Eeyore. Where in one case, in the Shadowfell, they're, in contrast to the Feywild where emotion is at its most intense, whether positive or negative, in the Shadowfell, there is a flatness to the gloom. And that's a really important thing to tease out as a DM, because both realms have scary locations, but in the Feywild, the emotion is heightened, whereas in the Shadowfell, it is dampened, which can be terrifying.
Right.
It's a quiet deadliness. And you can also imagine that in the Shadowfell, often beings will be very dignified, talk very calmly as horrible things unfold.
Right.
And so you can imagine that in the Shadowfell, even when you encounter kind creatures who mean you well, there would still be this stillness to them, a sense of calm and of no rush to get anywhere. Because also the Shadowfell is connected in many ways to the power of the negative energy plane, which is to say, on the spectrum of life and death, the Shadowfell is toward death, whereas the Feywild is much more toward life at its most intense.
Right.
They're both filled with living creatures, although the Shadowfell is also a realm jam-packed with undead.
Right.
But it is important to point out that just as the riotously colorful realm of the Feywild can have scary, gloomy things, similarly, the quiet, gray realm of the Shadowfell can have kindness, but rather than it being accompanied by parties and merriment like you might find in the Feywild, it might be accompanied by, a quiet dirge that, where you hear songs about beautiful things that have been lost, but, looking toward their return, perhaps after things have faded away, that they will be reborn. So both realms speak to each other in many ways. They are siblings, which is why there is not only connections between them, but also travel between them. In the Wild Beyond the Witchlight, there is this carnival that we associate with the Feywild, yet the owners of that carnival are from the Shadowfell.
Yeah.
And again, they are sibling realms. A Fey creature might be in wonderment about the quiet dignity of some place in the Shadowfell.
Right.
Because remember, the Shadowfell is also the realm of Ravenloft, and in the different domains of dread, there are places of intense beauty and dignity, but again, always it's the side of beauty that is touched by melancholy and death. But it is beautiful nonetheless.
You've got two new races that are in the Wild Beyond the Witchlight. You've got the Harengan, and then you've got fairies. Yes. I really appreciate that you can kind of like build your own fairy because there's like a pretty big spectrum. And I am rather I've always liked the very typical fairy with the kind of dragonfly wings, but I will confess the Pan's Labyrinth kind of aesthetic has appealed to me much more in the last 20 years. That kind of creepy Fae. What was important to kind of show off with the Harengan and also the Fairy as races?
So I'll start with the Harengan. The Harengan began as an NPC folk in the adventure, and we actually didn't have any plans initially to make them playable. It was largely the art that we got for them that we found so enchanting that we just as a team thought, you know what, people are going to want to play them. We want to play them. And so this is a great example of the game design being inspired by the art for the project. And that's how we ended up with playable rabbit folk. It was not a part of the original brief for this book. And it was just crucial for us, as we do anytime we make a playable race option that's inspired by an animal, we wanted to make sure that you really got a sense of being a rabbit person, hence, hopping and whatnot, and the energetic quality of the race. With the Fairy, it evolved as we worked. We pondered early on about bringing back the Pixie as a playable race. The Pixie was playable in 4th edition, and we thought initially that would be the natural choice. We ended up steering away from that because we already in the monster manual make it clear that the realm of the Fae is filled with a variety of different fairy-like folk. Because even in the monster manual, we have pixies and sprites. Folk tales in the real world are also filled with other fairy folk who are of different sizes, have different types of wings. They're not all, as you mentioned, they're not all dragonfly wings or butterfly wings. Sometimes they might be little bat wings, etc.
Yes.
And so what we decided is, rather than somewhat arbitrarily picking just one of the fairy types from the monster manual, the pixie, how about we instead create an option that is more fluid, that allows you to model different types of fae folk. You can easily make a person who feels like they're a cousin to pixies or sprites, but you can also use the fairy to make, as you want to, your favorite little Halloween inspired fae person. And that really was our goal, that the fairy is just sort of the all-purpose fae person. And we in many ways tried to have our cake and eat it too, where you're small rather than tiny like pixies and sprites, yet we give you the ability to cast, enlarge, and reduce. So if you really, really want to get to be smaller, you can. But we also made it so you can get bigger if you want to, because size-changing shenanigans are a big part of fairy tales, and so we decided to build that in. Flight, of course, was also important here. We went through, in the Unearthed Arcana process, different versions of the flight. We experimented with a much more powerful version of flight than that ends up in the book, where you could hover. Playtesters rightly pointed out that that was way too powerful. We knew it when we sent it out in Unearthed Arcana. We often send things out that we know are overpowered, but we're curious to see, what does the community think? The flight that the fairies ended up with is akin to the flight that Aarakocras have, where we make it so that you don't essentially get to be a mobile defense platform at first level of flying in heavy armor and are forever unhittable. So we've corrected for that in the final version, and I think people are going to be delighted. I'm looking forward to making fairies of different sorts, using what in a way is sort of a Fey template. That's really how I think of this race.